My husband has always been very good at making people laugh, especially when the joke is me. The laughter came a second too late, just enough for me to notice who hesitated and who didn't, just enough for me to understand exactly how far Jason was willing to go tonight, and as the crystal glasses clinked softly around the room and the chandelier cast that warm, almost theatrical glow across perfectly rehearsed smiles, I realized something important. This wasn't the first time he had done this, but tonight felt different. Tonight he wanted an audience. Emily still adjusting, he added lightly, swirling his drink as though he were discussing the weather. Some habits are hard to polish out, and there it was, subtle enough to pass as humor, sharp enough to land exactly where he intended. A few guests exchanged glances. Olivia Bennet let out a soft laugh behind her glass. Daniel Harris looked down, pretending not to hear, and I could feel every inch of the room measuring me, waiting, expecting a reaction, a defense, perhaps even embarrassment, but instead, I smiled. Not the polite, practiced smile they were used to, but something quieter, something steadier, because what none of them knew, what Jason didn't know, was that 3 months ago, entirely by accident, I had discovered something that didn't quite belong to him, something that connected his carefully built world to a name far more powerful than his own, my father's, Richard Carter, and ever since that moment, I had been watching, listening, waiting. So while they saw a woman being diminished, I saw a man stepping closer to a line he didn't even realize existed, and as Jason lifted his glass again, ready to continue, I tilted my head slightly, meeting his eyes just long enough for a flicker of uncertainty to appear, gone in an instant, but real, and in that brief silence between laughter and the next remark, I knew, he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Jason did not notice it at first, that brief flicker in his confidence, but I did, and that was enough, because once a crack appears, even the most polished performance begins to slip. Go on, Emily, Olivia Bennet said with a tilt of her head, her tone light but edged with curiosity. You must have something to say, and there it was, the invitation they all wanted, the moment where I was expected to either laugh along or quietly excuse myself, but instead, I lifted my glass, steady, unhurried, and let the silence stretch just a second longer than was comfortable. Long enough for the room to lean in without realizing it. I was just thinking, I said softly, my voice calm in a way that did not quite match the situation, how impressive it is, when someone builds something so convincing. A few polite smiles returned, uncertain now. Daniel shifted slightly, and Jason gave a short laugh, though it lacked the ease from moments before. Convincing, he repeated, almost amused, but I could hear it, that slight hesitation, the question behind the word, and I met his gaze again, not challenging, not defensive, just steady. Yes, I continued, especially when so many people believe it without ever asking who is really behind it. The air changed, subtle but undeniable, as if the room itself had paused to reconsider what it thought it understood. Olivia's smile faltered for half a second, and Jason, for the first time that evening, did not immediately respond, because somewhere beneath his confidence, something had shifted. Something small but dangerous, and as I took a quiet sip, I could feel it settle into place, the beginning of a different kind of conversation, one he was no longer entirely in control of. For a moment, no one spoke, and that silence said more than anything Jason had said all evening, because it was no longer polite, no longer comfortable, it was searching. I am not sure I follow, Jason replied at last, his tone measured, but there was a carefulness now, a slight recalculation behind his eyes. The kind he used in business meetings when something unexpected appeared, and that alone was enough to confirm what I already knew. I had his attention, of course, I said gently, as though clarifying something trivial. It is easy to overlook the foundations when the surface looks so refined. Daniel glanced up at that, just briefly, as if the word foundations had landed somewhere it should not have, and Olivia, who had been so quick to laugh before, now watched more closely, her curiosity sharpening. Emily, Jason said, this time with a faint smile that did not quite reach his eyes, you always did have a way with abstract thoughts, a subtle attempt to dismiss, to steer the room back under his control, but it came a fraction too late, because the shift had already begun, and I let out a soft breath, almost reflective. Perhaps, I said, but I have learned that what appears abstract is often simply unseen. Another pause, another beat too long, and this time, the weight of it settled differently, heavier, more deliberate, as though each word carried something just beneath it, something unspoken yet impossible to ignore. Jason's fingers tightened slightly around his glass, a detail most would miss, but I did not. because 3 months ago, in a quiet office he thought I would never enter, I had seen the documents, the signatures, the name that did not belong to him. And as I looked at him now, still standing in front of everyone, still trying to maintain that effortless authority, I realized something else. He still believed this was a performance he could control, and that belief, more than anything, was about to cost him. It was subtle, the way the room began to shift, not with noise but with attention, as if every person present had quietly decided that something more interesting than polite conversation was unfolding, and Jason felt it. I could see it in the way he adjusted his stance, just slightly, as though reclaiming ground that had never actually been lost. "You are being unusually reflective tonight," he said, his voice smooth again, controlled, but now there was intent behind it, a need to reassert himself, to remind everyone who set the tone here, and a few guests nodded along, grateful perhaps for something familiar to hold on to. But I did not step back, I did not soften, instead I let my gaze drift, briefly, across the room, meeting each pair of eyes just long enough to anchor their attention before returning to him. "It is an interesting evening," I replied, almost thoughtfully. "One learns a great deal when people feel comfortable." That word lingered, and this time it did not land lightly. Olivia straightened ever so slightly, Daniel exhaled through his nose, and somewhere near the far end of the table, someone set down their glass a touch too carefully, the kind of small sound that only exists when silence has weight. Jason gave a quiet chuckle, but it did not carry, not the way it had before. "Comfortable," he echoed, and there it was again, that flicker, brief but unmistakable, because he did not know what I would say next, and that uncertainty was new to him. "Yes," I said, meeting his eyes without hesitation now, comfortable enough to forget who is truly listening, and for the first time that evening, the balance tipped, not dramatically, not in a way that could be named outright, but enough for the room to feel it, enough for Jason to pause, just for a second, and in that second, everything he had been so certain of no longer felt quite as solid as it had before. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over the room in a way that made even the smallest movement feel deliberate, and Jason knew it. He could feel it slipping, not entirely, not yet, but enough to make him careful, which was something I had never seen before in moments like this. "You speak as though there is something we have all missed," he said, his tone still composed, but quieter now, less performative, as if he were no longer speaking to the room but directly to me, and that shift alone was everything, because it meant he was no longer certain of his audience. "Perhaps there is," I replied, letting the words sit between us without urgency, without pressure, because the truth does not need to rush, it only needs to exist. Olivia glanced between us, her earlier confidence replaced by a more measured curiosity, and Daniel, who had avoided involvement until now, leaned back slightly, watching with the kind of attention reserved for moments that matter. "Emily," Jason continued, this time choosing each word more carefully, "if you have something to say, I suggest you say it clearly, a challenge, but not as strong as before, not as effortless," and I allowed myself the smallest pause, just long enough for him to wonder if he had miscalculated. "Clearly?" I echoed, almost softly, then gave a faint, thoughtful smile. "Clarity can be inconvenient." That word landed differently, heavier, and for a brief second, Jason's expression tightened, not enough for most to notice, but enough for me, because I knew exactly what it touched: the documents, the signatures, the quiet transfer of authority hidden behind layers of presentation. And as I watched him now, standing in a room that still believed in his version of success, I realized something even more important. He still thought this was about embarrassment, about social standing, about saving face, and that misunderstanding, that single assumption, was the one thing that would prevent him from seeing what was coming next. It was the way he held my gaze that gave him away, not the words, not the posture, but that fraction of a second too long, as if he were searching for something he could not quite define, and in that search, the room shifted again, because people notice when certainty begins to thin, even if they cannot explain why. "Inconvenient for whom?" Jason asked, and this time there was no laughter around him, no easy agreement, just quiet attention, the kind that presses in without sound, and I let my eyes drift briefly to the table, tracing the rim of my glass with a slow, deliberate motion before looking back up. "For anyone who prefers things to remain unquestioned," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational, but each word placed with care, and that was enough to change the temperature in the room. Olivia did not smile this time. Daniel's expression sharpened slightly, and somewhere near the window, A guest shifted their weight as if suddenly aware they were part of something they had not intended to witness. Jason exhaled softly, a controlled breath, the kind used to steady oneself, and then he smiled again, though it no longer carried the same ease. "You are suggesting quite a lot without saying very much," he replied, an attempt to reclaim rhythm, to return this to something manageable, but the rhythm was no longer his to control, not entirely, and I tilted my head just slightly, considering him in a way I had never allowed myself to before. "Am I?" I asked quietly, then paused, just long enough for that question to linger, to invite doubt rather than resolve it, because doubt is far more powerful, and as I held that moment, letting the silence stretch once more, I saw it clearly, not just in him, but in everyone present, the shift from amusement to awareness, from certainty to curiosity, and that was when I knew, the evening had already moved beyond his reach, he simply had not realized it yet. It was no longer about what was being said, it was about what could not be unsaid, and that difference settled into the room like a quiet realization, one that no one could quite ignore. Jason's smile remained, but it had changed, refined into something tighter, more deliberate, as if he were now performing not for amusement, but for control. "If there is something to be understood," he said, his voice steady, measured with care, "I would rather not rely on implication," and there it was again. That need to bring everything back into the open where he believed he was strongest, but he still did not see it, he still believed clarity would protect him, and that belief made him predictable. "That is fair," I replied, my tone almost agreeable, which drew a few uncertain glances, because agreement was not what they expected from me, not now, not like this, and I let that moment breathe, just long enough for them to wonder if the tension had been misplaced, if perhaps this would dissolve. "After all," then I continued, softer this time, "although sometimes, what is understood does not need to be spoken aloud, a subtle shift, but enough to bring the tension back sharper than before." Olivia's fingers tightened slightly around her glass, Daniel leaned forward just a fraction, and Jason, for the first time, did not interrupt, because now he was listening, not leading, and that change, quiet as it was, altered everything. "3 months ago," I added, almost as if recalling something distant, something unimportant, and yet the words landed with weight, immediate and unmistakable, because time gives context, and context creates consequence. Jason's expression did not falter completely, but there was a pause, a brief stillness that had not been there before, and in that stillness, I saw it, the first real question forming, not for the room, but for himself. What exactly had I seen, and how much did I understand? And as that question took shape, I realized something else. He was finally beginning to catch up, just not quickly enough to stop what was already in motion. The moment I said it, I felt the shift land, not loudly, not dramatically, but with precision, like a key turning somewhere just out of sight, and Jason heard it, I could tell, because this time he did not respond immediately, he did not fill the silence with charm or humor, he simply watched me, carefully now, as if recalculating everything he thought he understood. "3 months ago," he repeated, quieter, slower, and there was something different in his voice, something closer to caution than confidence, and around us, the room held its breath without realizing it, because now there was a timeline, and timelines create meaning. "Yes," I said, almost gently, as though easing him into something inevitable. It was a rather ordinary afternoon, nothing remarkable at first glance. I let the words unfold slowly, measured, giving just enough detail to anchor their imagination without revealing too much, because what they pictured would always be more compelling than what I stated outright. Olivia leaned in slightly, her earlier amusement entirely gone, Daniel's attention fixed, unwavering now, and even those who had tried to remain detached found themselves listening, drawn in by the quiet certainty in my tone. "I remember thinking how quiet your office was," I continued, my gaze still on Jason, steady, unbroken, almost as if it was not meant to be entered without permission, a subtle line, but enough to place him there, enough to remind him of a space he believed was entirely his, and that was when it happened. Just for a second, his composure faltered, not visibly to most, but I saw it, that flicker of recognition, followed by something sharper, concern, because now he understood, not everything, but enough to know that whatever I had seen was not part of the version of him he had presented to the world, and as that realization settled in, quiet but undeniable, I allowed the smallest pause, just long enough for the weight of it to fully register, because once a truth begins to surface, it does not retreat. It only waits to be seen more clearly. Recognition is a quiet thing, It does not announce itself, it settles behind the eyes, shifts the way a person stands, the way they breathe, and in that moment, Jason changed, not entirely, not enough for most to notice, but enough for me to know that he had finally connected something he could not ignore. You went into my office, he said, and it was not a question, not quite, but there was something beneath it now, something sharper, something closer to unease, and the room felt it, the difference in his tone, the absence of ease. Olivia glanced at him, then at me, her curiosity now edged with something more cautious, while Daniel remained still, attentive in a way that suggested he understood more than he let on. It was not intentional, I replied calmly, offering just enough to soften the edges without removing the weight. The door was open, a simple detail, but one that carried implication, because doors are rarely left open by accident, not in places like his, not in lives built on control, and I let that thought linger without stating it outright, because suggestion invites imagination, and imagination deepens tension. Jason exhaled slowly, his gaze steady but no longer relaxed, as though he were measuring each possibility in real time, calculating risk, consequence, exposure. And what exactly do you believe you saw? He asked, his voice lower now, more controlled than confident, and that shift, subtle as it was, changed everything, because this was no longer about perception, it was about truth, and truth does not bend easily once it is named. I held his gaze, not challenging, not aggressive, simply certain, and allowed a brief pause to stretch between us, just long enough for the question to echo in the minds of everyone listening, before answering. Something that did not belong to you, I said quietly, and this time, the silence that followed was not curiosity, it was understanding beginning to take shape, slow, deliberate, and impossible to reverse. The words did not echo loudly, but they settled heavily, as if the room itself understood their meaning before anyone dared to respond, and this time, Jason did not mask it quickly enough. That brief tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible pause in his breathing, it was there, and once seen, it could not be unseen. That is quite a serious claim, he said at last, his voice measured, deliberate, but no longer effortless, and the difference was unmistakable now, because he was no longer speaking to entertain, he was speaking to contain, and that alone shifted the balance further. Olivia looked between us with a new kind of awareness, as though realizing she had stepped into something far more complex than social amusement. Daniel's gaze remained fixed, attentive, almost analytical, as if piecing together fragments that had previously seemed unrelated, and I allowed a small, thoughtful pause before answering, not rushing, never rushing, because time now worked in my favor. Is it a claim, I said quietly, or simply an observation that has not yet been discussed openly, a subtle distinction, but one that changed the weight of everything, because claims can be denied, observations must be addressed. Jason let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening slightly around the glass he still held, though he had not taken another sip. You are choosing a very particular moment for this conversation, he replied, and there it was, not denial, not dismissal, but deflection, a shift away from the content to the timing, and that told me more than any admission could, because people only question timing when the substance is difficult to challenge. Am I answered softly, meeting his gaze without hesitation, or is this simply the first moment where it cannot be avoided? And as the silence followed, deeper now, more deliberate, I could feel it fully settle, the truth no longer waiting in the background, but standing quietly at the center of the room, undeniable. And finally, impossible for him to ignore. There is a moment, just before everything changes, when the truth becomes too close to ignore yet has not fully revealed itself, and that is where we stood, suspended in a silence that no one seemed willing to break. Jason looked at me differently now, not with amusement, not even with irritation, but with a careful attention that bordered on restraint, as if every word from this point forward carried weight he could no longer control. You are implying a great deal, he said quietly, and though the words sounded composed, there was something else beneath them, something cautious, almost guarded, and that alone told its own story, because he was no longer certain of the ground beneath him. Not implying, I replied, my voice steady, calm in a way that made it impossible to dismiss, simply recognizing what is already there, and I let the words rest, not pushing further, allowing the room to absorb them, because sometimes restraint reveals more than confrontation ever could. Olivia shifted slightly, her earlier confidence now replaced with a more measured awareness. Daniel's focus did not waver, his expression thoughtful, as though aligning pieces that had quietly fallen into place, and Jason, for the first time, did not attempt to redirect the conversation, he did not reach for humor or charm. Instead, he held still, considering, calculating, and in that stillness, something became clear to everyone present. This was no longer a performance, not a social exchange, not a moment to be smoothed over with polite laughter. It had become something else entirely, something that required an answer, even if no one yet knew what that answer would be. Then perhaps, Jason said slowly, choosing each word with precision, you should be very certain of what you believe you understand, a final attempt to reframe, to regain footing. But the certainty he once held was no longer unquestioned, and I met his gaze without hesitation, without doubt, because what I knew was no longer something that could be undone. And as the quiet stretched once more, deeper than before, I realized that the moment he had tried to control at the beginning of the evening had already passed, and now, something else was taking its place, something he could no longer shape to his advantage. The truth does not need to be loud to be undeniable, and in that moment, it settled between us with a quiet finality that no one could ignore. Jason held my gaze, searching for something that was no longer there: control, certainty, advantage, all the things he had relied on just minutes before. And for the first time that evening, he said nothing, because there was nothing left that would restore what had already shifted. I let the silence linger, not as a weapon, but as a conclusion. Something earned rather than forced. Then I set my glass down gently, the soft sound marking the end of something far larger than a conversation. You were right about one thing, I said calmly, my voice steady, composed, no trace of hesitation. Some things are very difficult to polish, a quiet echo of his earlier remark. But now it carried a different meaning, one that no longer diminished me, but revealed him. A few guests looked away, others remained still, as though unsure where to place their attention. And Olivia, who had once laughed so easily, now said nothing at all. Daniel lowered his gaze briefly, thoughtful, as if acknowledging something unspoken, and Jason, standing in the center of it all, understood, not everything, but enough to recognize that the version of the evening he had intended no longer existed. What you built, I continued softly, meeting his eyes one final time, was never entirely yours, and I did not need to say more, because the truth had already found its place, not in accusation, but in understanding. And as I turned, stepping away from the center of the room, I realized something I had not fully allowed myself to feel until now. I was no longer waiting, no longer observing from the edges. Whatever came next would not be defined by what had been done to me, but by what I chose to do with what I knew. And behind me, the silence remained, not empty, but full, because some endings do not close a story, they reveal where it truly begins.